Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Happy November and happy extra hour of sleep.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'd like to welcome all of you gathered here and all of our associate candidates in Chicago Heights, Columbia, Missouri, and Jackson, Mississippi. And we continue to enjoy the beautiful season that God has given us, which now is blanketing the earth with the colors. During the month of November, our church calendar gives us many feasts to celebrate. On November 1st, we celebrated All Saints' Day, where we honor those who have been proclaimed in our church as saints, those whose lives continue to inspire us, but also we honor those who are personal saints for us. Yesterday, November 2nd, we celebrated All Souls' Day, remembering with love all of our family members, friends, and deceased who have touched our lives with their goodness. Our church sets aside this month of November to continue our prayers for the deceased, those we know and those whom we might not know. Last evening, our community had a special evening prayer to remember and pray for our sisters, relatives, and associates, whom we included for the first time in this prayer service, who have died since last November. It was wonderful to have the family members of our sisters and some family members of associates to join us for prayer and for supper. We were privileged to have Sister Mila, our leadership team member, also share with us yesterday one of their Peruvian traditions that honors the deceased and their families. Sister Mila had set up a table with table servings, pictures, foods, and treats that were special to her deceased family members. These included beer, which was a favorite of her father, and candy treats that her brother liked. Mila explained that in their country, they invite their deceased loved ones to come back on this day and join them at the table as a way of remembering them lovingly. So today we remember with Pam Coogan, one of our candidates, her brother Brian, who died recently, and also Aaron's, our tech person's mother, who also died recently. Eternal rest granted to them, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon them. And already we look to the season of Thanksgiving and our family gatherings. And so today, let us gather in thanksgiving. Our speaker today is Sister Mary Jean Traeger, and she will be presenting the history of the Springfield Dominicans. Sister will be leading us in prayer at the beginning and also in the prayer for the life of the world at the end. Sister Mary Jean has been a Dominican sister of Springfield, Illinois since 1962, during which time she served as teacher and or pastoral leader in numerous schools and parishes. She served for 16 years on the leadership team of our Dominican congregation, and during that time she was a founding member and on the leadership team of two organizations active in community organizing in the Springfield community: the Coalition on Housing Justice and Faith Coalition for the Common Good. As a member of the Springfield Dominicans, Sister joined with other Springfield sisters in establishing and developing SSTART, the Springfield Dominican Anti-Racism Team, organizing and training. For more than 20 years, she has worked with Crossroads in a contractual training relationship. In 2010, Sister Mary Jean participated in the formation and ongoing development of SCOTR, Springfield Coalition on Dismantling Racism, which is now a regional organizing partner with Crossroads, serving in the Springfield, Illinois area. In 2017, she was hired by Crossroads with a special focus on providing training for SCOTR and other Crossroads-based partners. She is currently retired from that position and continues to promote anti-racism wherever she can. Sister Mary Jean identifies as a white woman who has a deep commitment to the dismantling of systemic racism. She and we as Dominican women work together to become a multicultural anti-racism congregation and to form relationships with people of color that are both mutual and accountable. And so we welcome Sister Mary Jean.
I'm happy to be here and to share this presentation with you. We are going to start with a very brief prayer, because our prayer for the life of the world will be at the end. This is prayers of intercession that we prayed this morning at Mass, and it seemed like a good way for us to pray it again together, because do you remember who was the central character of the gospel today? Xxiii, yes. And so these intercessions help us to remember to pray for people that we sometimes don't think of praying for, or don't think deserve our prayer, or whatever might be the case. And so I'm going to invite you, there are 10 short responses here, and to each of the prayers that I lead, I invite you, I will say, we ask you, and then I invite you to say, Lord, hear our prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. In union with Pope Francis and our brother Zacchaeus in the gospel, and all who set the table of welcome, we ask you,
Lord, hear our prayer.
For those who are homeless and in need of Christ's shelter and ours, we ask you,
Lord, hear our prayer.
For those who are imprisoned and in need of transforming grace, we ask you,
Lord, hear our prayer.
For those who are immigrants and refugees in need of asylum, we ask you,
Lord, hear our prayer.
For those who have been violated by abuse and are in need of healing, we ask you,
Lord, hear our prayer.
For those who have done violence to others and are in need of a dramatic change of heart, we ask you,
Lord, hear our prayer.
For those who exclude others from the table of justice and are in need of humility and compassion, we ask you,
Lord, hear our prayer.
For those devoted to breaking down barriers of racism and honoring every person as a child of God's grace, we ask you,
Lord, hear our prayer.
For each of us, sinners all, in need of God's daily mercy, we ask you,
Lord, hear our prayer.
For those who have died yearning for the promise of eternal life, we ask you,
Lord, hear our prayer.
Amen.
Amen.
As Sister Mary Jones said, I'm going to be talking about the history of our congregation, but it may not be the usual way you're used to hearing people tell history. This happened, and then a few days later this happened, and then a few years later this happened. That's not the kind of history I'm going to be talking about today. And you're going to be sometimes perhaps a bit frustrated in wanting more than I'm giving on a particular topic, but have no fear. We will cover a number of topics, and then Sister Mary Joan has indicated that she has a book, which is the book that tells the history of the first 100 years of the Dominican Sisters of Springfield. And each of you will receive one of those books before you leave. So you can fill in the blanks all you want from thereafter. But we're going to be talking about 4 particular topics. And I'd like to have them be sort of the same amount of time. And if there's time, to allow you to have a little bit of time at least to talk to each other, to react to what you hear. If you hear something that surprises you, you can talk about that at your table. Or if you are confused about something or don't understand something that I said, you can ask. And please feel free to do that. Okay, let's go ahead and begin then. And the first part of the story is, of course, the founding of the congregation. The story of the Dominican sisters is many-faceted, like the exquisite artistic windows in our convent chapel. If you've been there, you know what I'm talking about, but here's an example. The lives and the history of the congregation are made up of many threads. There we go. Okay, thank you. So, besides the artistic windows in the chapel, our lives and our history are made up of many threads. Is this going to happen every time? Okay. And at the heart of all of it is community. It says most profoundly in some ways, that's who we are. Community following the cross of Jesus Christ, shaped by the gospel. So, from the beginning, the Dominican sisters there wasn't any Dominican sisters of Springfield. This is a 100-year anniversary picture. But, okay. In the beginning, there were 6 of them. Now you see there are more than 6 here. Because in and out, because of health issues and other things, the numbers fluctuated between 6 and 8. So this is a picture of our foundresses, and you can see there, starting on the right, on the left there, Sister Agnes McGuire, Sister Mary Cecilia Carey, Sister Mary Rachel Conway, who came to us by way of Cincinnati, and Sister Mary Thomas White, Sister Thomasina Simpson, Sister Mary Catherine Young, and our founding leader, Sister Mary Josephine Maher. Right, so 6 to 8, we say, because of the fluctuation of numbers. All of them considered our foundresses. Women who followed the call as Jesus called others and sent them out as disciples together. Every community has its founding story, and we learn it as we tell the story, and we change it sometimes as we tell the story, because we learn more things and we modify it. And that's what history is about. But most of all, history is not simply about learning the past. We study the past so that we know how to go forward into the future. And I'm going to say that maybe a lot of times today, but it's very significant. History is not just about old books of stories that you learned when you were a child, some of which you learned wrong because you were taught wrong, but that's another matter. But that's what history is for, to learn from the past and grow into the future as God leads us. That's kind of a mission statement. Okay, so the Springfield Dominicans were birthed by another group of Dominicans older in history than ourselves, the Sisters of St. Catherine in Kentucky. This is the picture of their old mother house when they were founded. And the sisters, they were Dominican sisters. They were the first Dominican sisters in this country. And it was, the story that I'm going to tell is very significant in that it intertwines with their story. They have been our rock that have helped to ground us in those 4 Dominican pillars that you learned last time: prayer, study, common life, and preaching. The long-term ancestors are, as they are for all Dominicans, St. Dominic De Guzman, who was the 12th century founder and the mentor, our mentor, every Dominican's mentor in preaching the gospel, along with St. Catherine of Siena, a whole multitude of other Dominicans. And you'll recognize that as the picture in our chapel that gives you some of the earliest Dominicans who were canonized. But we have lots more now. Okay, so this is a part of our heritage. Not all of it, but a part of it. And they were founded, I believe, in 1822. So they were founded before we were, the St. Catherine Dominican Sisters in Kentucky. And by the 1870s, you'll remember we had this terrible civil war that had about torn apart the whole country. And St. Catherine's was right in close to the midst of that, in the realities that they dealt with in that war. They, as they were teachers, but during that war they did a lot of nursing of both the Confederate and the Union soldiers. So by the 1870s, the war was supposedly over, and people were trying to make peace with themselves, trying to restore what had been lost and damaged terribly during that time of war, to mend the divisions that wounded the nation. And for the sisters to return to their teaching and to reaffirm their vowed life. But then, in 1873, one circumstance determined a major change in our history. The St. Catherine's congregation was asked to... Oops, there's the war. Okay, we can pass that on quickly. The St. Catherine's congregation was asked to break off a sprig from its southern roots and to go where they had not been before. There are 4 people that we often think of as the ones that were main actors in this part of the story. You'll notice I only have the picture of Bishop Peter Joseph Baltes from Illinois, from Alton, Illinois. The others I couldn't find pictures of, but Sister Regina O'Mara was the prioress at that time of the St. Catherine's Dominicans. And Father Cubero was the chaplain, the Dominican chaplain for the St. Catherine's Dominicans. So the 2 in the middle are St. Catherine's, and the 2 others are part of the actors that were dominant. Father Peter J. Mackin was a priest from Illinois who was sent by Bishop Baltes to bring sisters from St. Catherine's to Jacksonville, Illinois. That was They had never been in Jacksonville. They were Kentucky. And if you know anything about the culture of Kentucky, it's not Illinois. But that's what they were asked to do. And the bishop is the one who asked Mother Regina to send those sisters to Illinois. Now, there are all kinds of things you can read in the book about why it was so confusing and why they didn't know this or that or the other thing. Read the book. But the thing you most need to know is that the bishop asked for sisters from Kentucky. Mother Regina assigned the sisters you saw in the picture, but for whatever reason, things were delayed, and within 2 days of their hearing of this, they were on their way to Jacksonville. But there's another piece. The other piece is, though these 4 people knew a piece of the story that the sisters did not know. Their piece was, this wasn't just a mission to Illinois. This was an assignment to create a new foundation, a new congregation. Sisters from Kentucky going to Illinois to create a new congregation of Dominican sisters who would teach in Jacksonville. But somebody forgot to tell them that this wasn't a short trip. This was their assignment in a new life. And for whatever reason, they were there 2 years without knowing. And in fact, when it was what they thought was a time for them to go back to Kentucky and visit, Father Mackin finally figured out that they didn't know the whole story. And so it was his heavy burden task to sit down and tell them, you can't go home, you are home. Illinois is now your home. Jacksonville is now your home. Imagine getting the word that way. You are asked to form an independent congregation. And besides that, there's a document on the table that the bishop has sent asking you to sign that document and make it official now. Just imagine what that was like. And we've spent a lot of time in our history kind of mulling over that and what if and what if and what if. And I think we've come to the point in our history where we're saying it doesn't matter what if. What matters is that somehow, in a very mysterious way that we didn't know, God had a plan. And that plan involved our founding a new congregation in Illinois. And that's what we hold on to. We are still friends with those sisters in Kentucky, dear friends, have been forever. And the sisters were asked to sign that document. We have a part in the book that you're going to be read where Sister Thomas Aquinas says they couldn't decide as a group. There was some legal matter about it. Each sister had to decide for herself. And so they went to prayer and they spent the day in prayer, trying to make sense of what didn't make any sense to them, and trying to decide what they were called to do. And each sister, she writes, was called to search her own heart, weigh her own zeal, and measure her own vision. And in the end, they decided to sign the document. Ultimately, in freedom and commitment to God and to the congregation, they took a step that would determine the rest of their lives and began to become Dominican sisters in Illinois. Now, there's more that you can read about that, but the thing I want to end this part of the segment with is, out of one school in Jacksonville, a multitude, thank you for moving it along. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so I just brought in some pictures because sometimes people don't have an image of what it was for sisters to come from Kentucky to Illinois and just start teaching children. Now, this is not the most, I don't know what the date of this is, but you can tell by the clothing that it's not current. But that's one of the pictures. Sisters teaching elementary school children. Sisters teaching music. And look at those children. Where do you suppose they came from? Probably East St. Louis. Yeah, well, don't go too fast. Okay, so sisters in high school. Sister Regina Graham in high school. Sister Mary Megan. Sister Mary Megan, at the end of her untimely short life, taught children who were not in our Catholic school system, but were in the system, the public school system, that was not able to accommodate their needs, was not able to help them become the students they had the ability to be, but didn't know how to. And she was excellent with teaching that. And then eventually, we even began to teach adults. And so you'll recognize Sister Phyllis and her RCIA students. And finally, because it's ongoing, we now have sisters who are teaching immigrants and refugees in the Chicago area, and teaching them particularly how to become citizens in this country. It's getting to be more and more challenging, but that all of that is teaching. So sometimes we hear people in the parish or even our own sisters say, we're not teaching anymore. We will never stop teaching. We are always teaching. And we are always looking at our world and saying, how does that teaching need to be manifested today? These people cannot read English. We need to teach them so that they can apply for citizenship, and on and on and on. So it's very important that we see that in a very significant way, teaching has been an ongoing foundation of our congregation. There was a time in recent history when we, like the Dominican friars, who had always been called preachers, when the Dominican sisters began to claim that identity as preachers. And so our teaching and our preaching blends together in presenting the gospel. Okay, so that's the first segment, and I want to point out some of the handouts that you have on your table. I think yours are yellow, and one side of the handout is the outline of the presentation and a little blurb telling you what it's about. We just finished the first one, Journey in an Unknown Pathway. On the back are questions for each of the segments. And we're already a little bit behind. So I'm just going to ask you to take a couple of minutes of silence now and read to yourselves those first two questions under question number 1. And reflect for yourselves on what it would be like if you had received a message like the sisters did, and how you could come to peace with that. So a couple of minutes. Okay, now I'm going to suggest, because it is important for you to be able to talk to each other about this, that might be something you want to talk about during the break. Okay? And as we go along with another topic, but we'll try to catch up a little bit because we have 3 more segments to do and a break. So, but just to carry that sense of how, not just to dwell on how awful it was that they didn't know, but how did God make sense out of that reality for them in a way that 146 years later, or 149 years later, whatever it is, we're here because of those sisters, yes. And we thank God for that. And we thank God for all who have come after them, including the associates who are now part of the picture. Okay, so let's go on to the second segment. Sister Bernice, would you just read what it says about the second segment on this paper? And under the... oh,
Dominicans in the South. Expanding ministry to include health care, becoming an anti-racist institution.
thank you. Okay, so we have the history, the founding history, clearly education, clearly teaching. Children, but not only children, adults, all kinds of people in all kinds of ways. Well, one of the things that happens to us every few years, it's either 6 or 5 or whatever the current time is the leadership of the congregation changes. In fact, it has recently changed, as you probably know. And so at one point, there was another prioress who followed Sister Mother Regina. I don't know if she followed her immediately. I don't think so. But there was a Mother Marie who was prioress of the congregation. And she had it in her head that it would be good if we had health care. Now imagine, she didn't just wake up one morning and say, I think we'll start some health care. But she listened to the Spirit and gradually had the sense that this was something good to do. We didn't have to give up teaching, but it was something that we could do. And so sometimes the Spirit shows us how to let go of something in a particular place or a specific way of serving, and then to pass that on to someone else as God calls us elsewhere. Sometimes we don't have to let go of one in order to pick up another part of the ministry. We have to keep listening to the Spirit. So, at this point, Mother Marie was not able to complete her dream because she died. But before she died, she had begun to train sisters in nursing. She had the sense that God was calling us to this, and she knew how how to start. And it was up to somebody else to take over. And that's what happened. So, she had been educating sisters as nurses, and that turned out to be timely preparation because it invited people to provide care in 2 small hospitals in Texas. The sisters, the Dominican sisters, who had been in Jacksonville and by that time had been teaching all over the place, had opened schools and all of that. But we were invited to take on 2 small hospitals in Texas. And you can read about that in the book. By the 1940s, the sisters were ready to take on 2 larger health endeavors. Whoops. I put that picture in here just to show you the surprising way God works in our world. You're going to see some of these people again. But I love that picture because it tells us how God surprises us. All right, so we're talking now about Catholic health care, not just anywhere, but in the South. If you know anything about, and please, if you know these people or you know these pictures and you say, that didn't happen in that place, just take it for granted that it happened someplace. It happened someplace where our sisters were. I believe it was in Jackson, Mississippi, but it might have been in one of the other hospitals. Okay? These are the hospitals that the sisters were asked to take on. The hospital in Wellington, Texas, hospital in Shamrock, Texas, which were both very small and relatively short-term ministries. But the other 2 were much longer term. St. Mary's Hospital in Rogers, Arkansas, and I've got pictures of those last 2. This is the Jackson Infirmary. It's a pretty dilapidated area in Jackson, Mississippi that the sisters were asked to take over and try to bring some vitality to, try to make it into an institution. And this is a spoiler alert, but I'll tell you that not this building, but what the sisters did as a response to taking on this building was to become St. Dominic's health system in Jackson, Mississippi, and you'll be seeing pictures of that later. The other larger hospital was St. Mary's Hospital in Rogers, Arkansas. It was very different from Jackson, but it had one thing in common. Actually, all 4 of those hospitals had one thing in common. They were in the South. Now, if you know anything about the South, Mississippi, Arkansas, Texas, the culture is different. Sisters had never worked in those places before, but they learned. I think they were great learners. One of the things that we were told as we heard the history of this part of our congregation is the fact that the sisters did locate in the southern part of the United States was very significant. You may know that there were parts of the South that were very poor and that needed this kind of care and didn't necessarily have the facilities or the services. or people to educate the nurses to do what needed to be done. So but the thing that's significant about this is there weren't as the Catholic population in the South at that time in particular, it's changed a bit now, but at that time in particular was not very much Catholic. And in fact, sometimes you would think might be a little bit resentful or maybe a lot. But the reality is that the sisters were assigned, they came, they learned to do what they did, and they had ways of consistently working with the people in using their own management system, skills for health care, which they learned. They had to go to nursing school also. And they were well received. And the sisters, many of the sisters still, and you'll hear it about Rogers in particular, some of our sisters still visit some of the people in Rogers, Arkansas, with whom they had been friends for many, many years. We were often told that the sisters manifested a compassionate Dominican spirit that the populations not familiar with Catholic sisters were not acquainted with, but came to understand and accept and love. And it was mutual. So, one of the things that we want to say also about Jackson, Mississippi, is that the sisters were already established at St. Dominic's when the civil rights movement burst on the scene. And so this was in the state of Mississippi, which, as you may know, is a state that during the time of the civil rights movement, and during the time of the Civil War for that matter, was consistently resistant of integration. And the sisters who were operating healthcare institutions, that was what they were sent to do, didn't know anything at the beginning about how to deal with integration. Nobody did. It in a sense, it kind of exploded on the population in a way and there was a lot of resistance to it. So the sisters struggled with the daunting task of trying to follow laws, sometimes laws that were quite inadequate, and at the same time to keep their first primary focus of providing adequate health care for people of color and white people who came to their hospital. They tried to find ways to move desegregation forward, and sometimes they were successful and sometimes they weren't. And they were the first to know that they were not achieving their goals as much as they would like. But in the midst of the growing violence and resistance, they stayed and they endured. And we are grateful for it. And one of the benefits, the long-term benefits of the work of Jackson, Mississippi, of St. Dominic's, is that it laid the groundwork for a long-term effect that was the whole congregation was later involved in, which was the anti-racism effort. The Dominicans, the hospital in Jackson, Mississippi has formed its own anti-racism commitment, and it continues to do so, even as the Dominican sisters have made a commitment to become an anti-racist multicultural congregation. That all came about in Jackson, Mississippi, which some people would think was amazing. And it continues. And the whole organization, both the health system and the Dominican sisters, are committed to becoming anti-racist institutions. And that's a lifetime process. And St. Dominic's put forth its long-term efforts in Jackson, and the whole congregation has collaborated with them and with others, as you'll hear later. There's one more piece about healthcare, and this is bringing us up to the present. It's no secret that the growing complexity of healthcare necessitates a creation of a more collaborative way of providing services to people. It's all you hear talked about, even in the election process. We're always talking about how to improve healthcare. And so it is a growing complex reality that we face. And we can't do it alone. It's becoming increasingly difficult and impossible, actually, for a standalone hospital to continue to serve in the way we might have served in the past. And so the Dominican Sisters of Springfield have been looking at that reality and saying, what can we do to assure that the quality Catholic health care that has been provided in the South in many of these places will continue into the future? And it will have to look different. And we're in the process, have been in the process of doing that. And recently, we have transferred sponsorship of St. Dominic's system in Jackson to another strong Catholic partner. The partner are known as the Franciscan Missionaries of Our Lady Health System, and they're based in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So they're already in the South. They've been serving in the South for some time. And they are taking on a portion or a significance reality. They are taking on the sponsorship of St. Dominic's along with other groups that they're working with. That places us in as one of 8 health systems that collaborate in an arrangement that is enabling Catholic healthcare to remain alive and vibrant in the South, even in Mississippi, for many years to come. We had to make some changes in the way we looked at our institutions so that those institutions could be ready to continue into the future. That's a lot of what our history is about. What have we learned from the past that we can now carry into the future? And what do we have to do differently? And we're asking those questions a lot, and sometimes we get uncomfortable with hearing those questions. But they are critical because there's nothing so, I don't forget what the quote is, but there's nothing so blank as change. Change has to happen. Not for the sake of change, but for other realities to come forward and take their place and make the institutions better and keep them healthy and alive and serving the public. So, the Sisters of the St. Dominic's has transferred sponsorship of the healthcare system to the Franciscan Sisters of Our Lady. And together with them and others, they are collaborating in finding ways to keep that institution and that service alive. And the sisters, some of the sisters will continue to be serving there, even as this other group of sisters comes in and works with them. It's a collaborative effort. And it will keep the name of St. Dominic's. So, this is truly an engagement of two charisms. The Dominicans, the Dominican charism of St. Dominic's and others, and the Sisters of the Catholic Healthcare Sisters. I lost the title of it, but Franciscan Missionaries of Our Lady. So, and just a little aside, you remember St. Mary's in Rogers, Arkansas? In a much less complex reality, some years ago, they did a similar thing. They collaborated with the Mercy Sisters, who, Mercies of the Americas, have lots of health systems. And those two health systems came together so that we could continue to have that service of Catholic health care in that area. Okay, you've had a lot of information, and so let's take a couple of minutes of silence just to kind of mull over what you've heard. You've heard a lot. And we're halfway through. That didn't just belong to the hospitals or to the health systems. That belonged to the whole country. And that was something that we, to this day, haven't finished with. We haven't learned sufficiently how to be anti-racist institutions who can collaborate with others regardless of our color, our culture, whatever. Okay. So yes, thank you for bringing that up. That was and is continuing to be important. And it's a lot deeper than we think. It's a lot deeper than I have to learn how to be nice to somebody who's a different color from me now. We know that. But we haven't, and that's why we have training, and it's here now. We are part of this organization as Dominican Sisters. St. Dominic's works with the training that Crossroads provides for anti-racism work. And if we hadn't engaged and continued to engage that group of organizers and trainers, we wouldn't be where we are now. And in some ways, we often say we just barely have scratched the surface. But what we knew, just as we learned with the health system, that St. Dominic's could no longer continue as a standalone hospital, we needed to join with others. The same thing is true in the anti-racism work. We can't dismantle racism alone. Individually, we can't do it. Our institution can't do it alone. Other institutions, we have to collaborate. We have to train. We have to learn to be different as institutions. And so that's one of the things that we carry with us through everything that we're doing into the future. Thanks for bringing that up. Okay, I think they're ready for some snacks. Feel free to talk about anything, but don't forget to talk about some of the things that you might be wondering about, like that one. That was a great question. Thank you. Here's a little piece of information that is helpful. You know, until we talk about these things, we don't know what the other person doesn't know. And so when somebody asks a question, you think, oh, yeah, I should have put that in there. I should have filled that in. So there's a question about sisters. Always question about sisters. We are Dominican sisters of Springfield, Illinois. That is our official title. That is our ministry. And we have places in town where we minister, but we also have places elsewhere, a lot of different places where we minister. And there's another group of sisters who also have an institutional presence in Springfield. And they're known as, somebody help me with it now, the Hospital Sisters of St. Francis. Okay, so I know that some people were getting confused with, and then I put in another Franciscan group, which is in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and that confused things more. So there are groups, and this is the way the sisters are generally organized, that they form a congregation together, and they have a special charism, meaning a special spirit that they carry with them, and they promote and they spread with their ministries. And another group might come in and have a different quality, and they would have maybe another institution. So we have, as I said at the beginning, we started out as teachers. And we did a lot of teaching, and we still do a lot of teaching. And don't let anybody tell you we don't, because we do. And we can do other things. What does it say? You can chew gum and walk and chew gum. So the same thing. We can do other things. But there is a primary focus that we take, and that's where we go. Now, but then God steps in and drops something in our laps that we didn't even think about, like, I think you ought to do health care. We had never done health care before, and here we are. And we have done health care across the South for more than 70 years. So no matter what we decide we're going to do, sometimes God has a different plan or an additional plan. And so we didn't have to do health care in Springfield because there's another institution there. But there was a need in the South. Okay, so we're ready for the third segment. And the third segment is going to take us far away, far, far away. So, this is St. St. This is a wonderful picture of St. Dominic's. I don't think it's the most current picture, but it's a beautiful picture of St. Dominic's in Jackson, Mississippi. And if you know Mississippi, if you're riding on 55 and you come into Jackson and you come up over a hill, you're going to see that cross. And you're going to see that institution, which is spread out much more than it shows in that picture. And remember that little dilapidated Jackson Infirmary that I showed you the picture of? This is the same institution and how it has grown and developed over the years. And now, thanks to our collaboration with another institution of sisters who do health care, we have an arrangement that will allow St. Dominic's and other Catholic health care in Mississippi to continue well into the future. That's what collaboration is for. Okay, so now, while the civil rights was burgeoning in the U.S. in the 60s, and the sisters in Jackson were struggling to integrate St. Dominic's in ways that would make the healthcare service equitable and peaceful. While they were doing that, a very different reality was germinating in Sacred Heart Convent, in the halls of Sacred Heart Convent. Okay, I'm going to turn this first. Keep you guessing here. What's wrong with? Okay, there are your questions, which we didn't get to spend much time with. Okay. This gives you the picture that we're going far away. From the southern United States to south of the border, missions in Peru. So while all this turmoil was going on in the United States, something else was happening in the Catholic Church, which wasn't, sometimes it was and sometimes it wasn't alert to the what was going on in the civil rights movement. But in addition to that, something was happening in Rome. Pope John the 23rd urged religious communities. Now, we talked about religious communities of Franciscans, of Dominicans, and then another group of Franciscans. So there are lots of different groups of sisters. And John the 23rd invited them to look to the south, to Latin America, and to send 10% of their sisters to minister in that area over 10 years' time, because the need was so great in Latin America. Now, we know stories about all the fighting and wars and all of that, but anyway, the Pope asked for sisters to go to Latin America. And Sister Ida Marie Adams was another prioress general of our congregation. And I think she was an extraordinary pioneer. She got a letter from the Pope, and she wrote back and said, "We'll do it. We'll send sisters to Latin America." So she called for volunteers among the sisters, and 4 sisters, well, probably more than 4 came forward. 4 were chosen. And they were chosen to go to Peru, South America. Got to pay attention to this. Andes Mountains, probably the foothills. And these are the 4 sisters. In those days, because of the way we were taught, or mistaught in some cases, those sisters probably thought that they were bringing Christ to South America. They soon discovered Christ was already there. And Christ was present in the gracious generous people who welcomed the sisters and who reflected the face of Christ with their spirit of joyfulness, and who taught them a different way of being than what they were familiar with. More of the terrain. So, the sisters were, the four sisters who went there were sent to minister and to do whatever was needed in the area. But they had a lot to learn. They'd stumbled over a new language, Spanish. They braved the travels in the Andes. You just saw some of it there, especially during the rainy seasons. But they were overwhelmed and still happy, doing what they believed God wanted them to do. Their joy was so contagious that at some point they asked, some of the young women in Peru came to the sisters who were there to serve and asked them if they could become Dominican sisters. Our sisters who were there were touched by their requests, and they sent their requests to the congregational leadership in the States and to the whole congregation, who all together talked it through and discerned together. And eventually, the leadership of the congregation agreed that we would welcome Peruvian women into our ministry, into our congregation, not just to do the work, but to live the life, to be sisters with us in this congregation. The leadership supported the decision. They accepted the Peruvian women. They prepared with the intention, the idea of the sisters, of the young women becoming Dominicans was not that they would come to the United States and work for us, but that they would serve in their own country, that they would provide in their own country. And they have continued to do that. One of the sisters wrote with joy in March of 1986 that a new era had begun in the history of the Springfield Dominican community. This day, 4 young Peruvian women, they are, entered the house that had been prepared for them, and we became, at least began to become, a multicultural international congregation. And we have continued to receive sisters, young women, as they feel called to join us. And I think we have 8 or 9 now in Peru. Well, one of them's not in Peru right now. Okay, so we became a multicultural international congregation. And that doesn't happen by just putting on a hat that says, now we're multicultural and international. It's hard work, as it always is when cultures come together and try to understand each other and learn from each other. Meanwhile, in Peru, in the mountains, and again, this picture isn't exactly the best one, but it has guns, and that's why it's in there. There was danger brewing in a college town called Ayacucho in the mountains. A young man named Carlos Abimiel Guzman was biding his time and surrounding himself with malcontents who would follow him in a Marxist movement that he called Sendero Luminoso. Perhaps you've heard of it. Sendero Luminoso, Shining Path. Early in the 1980s, Guzman agitated students toward violence. The military, as you might expect, reacted with repressive measures against their own people. The chaos that was created pitted innocent people, family members even, against one another. It led to the killing of thousands of innocent people in the upper Andes, Peruvian peoples. It was terrorism, and it reigned as undeclared war that devastated the country for 20 years. In the midst of the terrorism, our sisters who were there discerned that they should stay rather than go home to the States where they would be safe. They wanted to be with the people, and the council, the leadership of the congregation, agreed and allowed them to stay. The sisters joined other groups, sometimes other groups of sisters, sometimes of lay people, missionary teams who visited the people who were caught in the violence. As so often happens, when people are poor, nobody pays any attention. They put a face on the people who were ignored by the rest of the world, who watched as violence tore a country apart. The religious were not exempt from the terror. There are lots of stories that many of our sisters served in Peru at that time, and they can tell you some of the stories. I remember celebrating Mass in the dark because one of the groups, whether it was the Sendero or the military, had turned off the electricity. It was a way to intimidate people. Gratefully, none of our sisters were killed. None of their families were killed during that time. Well, maybe some of them were killed. I don't know. I don't know that for sure. But it was wrong to say that even if they were not killed, it's wrong to say they were not harmed. We know what terrorism does to people. We know that they faced the prospects of dying every day they stepped outside their front door. They buried some of their friends that were murdered by the senderos or by the military. You never really knew who was going to kill whom. They've likely carried those scars of war for a long time after the fighting ended and the process of truth and reconciliation had concluded. These are our Peruvian sisters who now have taken on leadership in Peru. There are no white sisters serving there now. They are leading the congregation in Peru and working with the people in the community and remaining vowed Dominican sisters of Springfield, or as they like to say, Dominicans of Our Lady of the Sacred Heart. The group continues to serve in the widespread countryside. In July of this year, The Dominican sisters had a general chapter, and we had another first, as we elected our first native Peruvian sister to leadership on the General Council. Mila is the one in blue up there. She's now serving on our council, and it begins another chapter in our congregation. I think I've got one more picture. This is the day they were all elected. So it's a first for us, and we hope not a last. And that's Peru. Let's take a couple of minutes of silence. Okay, we have one more piece, so let's go on to this one, and then we'll come back, and if you have questions, we'll see if we can get some of them addressed at least. This one is very different from the others. Remember, I've been saying over and over again, history is not about the past alone. It is about what we learn from the past that takes us forward into the future. And now we're looking as a world, as a universe, into a different way of understanding, as Pope Francis calls it, our common home. So this final piece is about newer discoveries, new scientific discoveries that have been introduced to us and that have introduced elements of creation beyond earlier reckonings in ways that we've not been able to imagine until now. And we're still learning and growing and opening. So we're talking about the mystery of our universe. All of us learned that beautiful, poetic story of the creation of the world. And I hope we're all learning that it is a story. It is a poetic way of expressing the inexpressible. And what we're trying to do now is learn the amazing, extraordinary evolution and continual growth of the universe, of this gift and everything else that touches it, that surrounds it. So, we're talking about the mystery of the universe, which we have learned from our history and our science, has a history of about 13.8 billion years. That's how old scientists have determined, approximately, that our universe is. We begin with some kind of a singular event, which we've always called the Big Bang. And yet, what that is has not yet been explained or discovered or fully understood by any of the scientists who've been working in this field. But that's the beginning of what we think of as the universe. The exploration of the universe opens up a whole new way of imagining our amazing creation. We learn that our whole life, our whole existence, Our whole existence is interconnected in the deepest, most profound way. Well, we celebrate our own uniqueness. Each of us is a unique person, and we study the uniqueness of human reality. We realize at the same time that we are not really separate from each other, or for that matter, from anything else in the universe. We are all one. Furthermore, the universe is not a static thing. It's like, okay, there it is, and it just sits up there in outer space. It's not static. It's continually expanding in an evolutionary movement. We continually are, not just we, but the universe and we in it are continually becoming every day, growing into deeper communion, into more profound beauty, into opening ourselves to who God really is. And we know we will never be finished with that discovery. The universe is future-oriented, ever evolving. The universe doesn't look back. It's grounded in the past, but it doesn't. It's future-oriented, ever evolving, continually unfinished. We had an article in our Just Words that said something about the unfinished universe, and it made all the difference in the world. We are always reaching for greater meaning. If you think about it, as humans, we are always reaching for greater meaning. And so is the whole universe. This moves us beyond a narrow way of thinking to an inclusive, cosmic understanding. It has the potential, and you think about the world today when I say this, it has the potential to draw us all together in unity, recognizing that we are all related, we are all neighbors of one another. And we know how far away we are from that right now. And yet, the universe is urging us towards that. So we move forward by collaborating, not competing, for scarce resources. We share abundance of Earth's gifts. At least that's what we're meant to do. Imagine what this could mean in a world that seems intent on battling over scarce resources. A world that seems intent on despising those who are different from ourselves, competing with power over others. Imagine what opening our minds and our hearts and our worlds to this spacious world, this spacious way of being that creates harmony and blessing among us. Imagine what that could mean. And this is not a fairy tale. It's not something somebody made up and wrote up to try to convince us of something. The discovery is coming from something that has not happened probably since the beginning of the world. But scientists, we know, have been studying the universe and all of its mysteries for a long time. But in recent times, at least in some circles, theologians, people who study about God, have joined scientists in trying to understand the mystery of the universe. Scientists and theologians are working together to open the whole universe to discovery and celebration. What kind of future might be available to every person if we learned how to honor differences in our faith practice instead of fighting over them? If we learned to know God in multitudes of ways, because God is more multitudes of ways than we can ever imagine. And we make God so small. I remember, this is just an aside, I remember when I was a child, or maybe a teenager, and we were talking about the faith, Catholic faith, of course, and I could never understand how a God who was so vast and so large and so expansive would only let this small group of people into heaven. I never could understand that, and I no longer believe it, because God is expansive. And we don't know what that means, and we don't know what that calls us to. And we don't know what that demands of us. But we have a God who never stops loving and caring and drawing us forward. And that's a God that some of us have spent years and years and years having struggled to believe in because it's too good to be true. But wouldn't you rather have that kind of a God? So, this God's expansive grace in the universe opens us all up to that mystery and helps us see God as much more abundance and beauty and goodness not yet explored. Walking into the mystery of God's amazing expansiveness opens us to a God who loves and cares for our world as we explore the ever-expanding wonder of God's mystery. I mentioned before the general chapter of our congregation when we spent a lot of time talking and thinking and praying about the future. Not just the future of our congregation as an institution, but about what God might be calling us to. As we now know what we know and we never knew before about the universe, how expansive it is, and how expansive God is, and what that calls us all to be part of. To be open to the future. We have received, and I think you've got them here to hand out, we have, at the end of our chapter, we always have a statement that we created. And this time, we asked a group of sisters to come together and to create a statement that would represent what we were trying to say in our chapter. And as the Spirit would have it, they didn't come up with a statement, they came with a prayer. And it's a prayer that has really transformed and continues to transform us every time we pray it. And so I'm going to ask that we would invite people to share this prayer. And I'm going to ask you to do it in a certain way, but I'll wait till you get the papers passed out. I need one too. I think I gave mine away. You'll notice on one side the prayer is in English. And on the other side, maybe upside down, the prayer is in Spanish. We have some Spanish-speaking people with us here today. So I'm going to ask us to do, let's see. Okay, let's do it this way. First, I'm going to ask anyone who speaks Spanish in a minute to stand and read the first and the second statements. Well, to read the whole prayer. Okay? Read it carefully, slowly. And those of you who do not know Spanish, don't read off the papers. Listen to the tonalities. Listen to what you hear. Okay, anybody who speaks Spanish.
Oración por la vida del mundo.
Santo Misterio.
Siempre antiguo, siempre nuevo. Nosotras, las Dominicas de Springfield, venimos ante ti, conscientes de nuestra interconcepción cósmica y en solidaridad con los rostros concretos de los y las marginadas. Venimos ante ti profundamente agradecidas por nuestro llamado común. Haznos entrar en comunión contigo y con toda la creación, viviendo con conciencia internacional y apertura al cambio. Deseamos expandir la forma en que expresamos nuestros votos, invitando a otros y a otras a caminar con nosotras al compartir nuestro carisma. Libera nuestros corazones para reconocer y atender a Cristo en lugares ocultos e inesperados. Renunciamos a nuestra participación en el pecado del racismo y rechazamos las barreras sociales creadas por el abuso del poder. A través de nuestra contemplación, transfórmanos para escucharnos en profundidad la una a la otra y a nuestro mundo herido. Bendice nuestros esfuerzos de ser la santa predicación. Cristo, tú eres expansivo. Caminamos en nuestra verdad, ofreciendo nuestro testimonio de vida. Amén.
In the prayer, in English, there are a couple of places where there are some Spanish words inserted. In the first paragraph, rostros concretos. The idea is that that word in Spanish is so powerful and so strong that we don't have words that match it. And so we put the Spanish word in the English prayer because of its power. You see at the bottom it says literally means specific faces. Rostros concretos are the people whose faces we look at and don't look at. We pass by, we don't pay attention to. The poor, the immigrants, the LGBTQ, all these people we're holding in our prayer. At the bottom of the page, right above the Amen, there's another Spanish phrase. It's easier to understand. Testimonio de vida. It means the testimony of our lives. And again, There's something about saying it in a different language that makes it profound in a way maybe that our own English doesn't. So let's all stand and have this prayer together in English, and it will be the closing of our prayer. A prayer for the life of the world. Holy mystery,
ever ancient, ever new, we, the Dominican sisters of Springfield, come before you, aware of our interconnectedness in the cosmos, and in solidarity with the rostros and tresos of our marginalized. We come with deep gratitude for our common call. Draw us into communion with you and all creation, living with intentional awareness and openness to change. We seek to expand the expression of our vows, inviting others to walk with us in sharing our charism. Free our hearts to recognize and attend to Christ in hidden and unexpected places. We renounce our participation in systemic racism and reject the societal barriers created by the misuse of power. Through our contemplation, transform us to listen deeply to one another and to the brokenness of the world. Bless our efforts to be the holy preaching. Christ, you are expansive. We journey in that truth, offering our testimonial de vida. Amen.
I'm aware that this prayer was written for the Dominican sisters, and so we're saying we Dominican sisters, but you surely are all participants with us in that prayer. So we offer it to you as we've been praying with it. Thank you.
A very special thank you to Sister Mary Jean, who certainly has shown us in her presentation the expansiveness of our God in the way God has worked in our history and in our future to come. In the prayer that Sister mentioned as I'm traveling around to the different groups of associates this year, we're asking the associates to pray this with us by adding in the second line, we the Dominican Sisters and Associates of Springfield, and then by adding in the next stanza, we seek to expand the expression of our vows and commitments, because that is what many of you have already taken and what those who are candidates are working toward. So it can help us all own the prayer. A very special thank you again to Sister for her presence with us and the hours that she's put into the presentation. I think you could hear the 4 pillars in that presentation that we listened to last week and how God has guided us. A thank you too to those who brought snacks. They just get better and better. To Sue Clary, Diane Keller, Ed Norman and Grace Cardenas, and John Syvac. And Patty, did you add to that today? Okay. Our Springfield cluster associates that joined us today are over there. Teresa Bennett, Marion Jenkins, Patty Fitzgerald, and Kathy Becker was here earlier. So we thank them for their assistance, and always Sister Martha Marie, who is setting everything up for us. Those of you who received little cards as you came in, as a reminder that you still owe me something, as a Christmas gift, next time that you come, could you bring that with you or send it to me by email? And for those that are in other locations, I will send an email if I'm still missing something from your papers, either a picture or a baptismal certificate. This week is a celebration of National Vocation Awareness Week. And Sister Denise has sent out to all of us in our community the activities that are filling this week, this day being the first of those activities. Tuesday, Sister Kathleen, one of our sisters, is representing us at Marian University in Indianapolis. There's the teaching and the preaching that continues. Wednesday, we are inviting SHG's juniors and seniors to come and visit us for an evening prayer, supper, and games and conversation. Thursday is a day of prayer, and here, beginning with the noon Mass, or the 11:25 Mass, we expose the Blessed Sacrament all day until 9 o'clock at night. You, as candidates and associates, are always welcome to come to our chapel anytime during that day on Thursday to join us in prayer. And then Friday is another SHG student day with the sisters. And Sunday, Sister Beth, that's joining us today, Sister Pat Stark, Charmaine, and Sister Denise are going to Alexis Parish in Beardstown to share Eucharist with discerning families and friends. So we ask you also, among your families, to talk about Dominican vocations and certainly invite them to be a part of us and any of the activities that we have. Our next meeting will be held on the first Sunday of Advent, December 1st. Can you believe it? December already. Our presenter will be Sister Elise Marie, who will be speaking on mission and ministry. And the snacks are provided then by Betsy Vogt, Ed and Grace and Norma Cardenas. Again, I understand it's a Mexican theme next time. So I wish you and your families a very happy Thanksgiving, and please know that in my prayer I'll be thanking God for all of you throughout this month. So God bless and safe travels home.